When I found my daughter living as a maid in the $6.5 million house I bought her, she did not even recognize me as her father. I calmly called my lawyer and said it is time for justice. My name is Anthony Wallace, and for the last 16 years, I lived a life of constant motion. I built a global logistics empire from the ground up, spending my days navigating shipping ports in Singapore, managing supply chains out of Rotterdam, and sleeping in corporate hotel rooms across 3 continents. It was a lucrative life, a demanding life, but it was also an incredibly lonely one. The wealth I accumulated was staggering, but it came at the ultimate price. I missed birthdays, I missed holidays, and most painfully, I missed the everyday moments with my only child, my daughter, Rachel. When Rachel married Jared Lawson a decade and a half ago, I tried to alleviate my immense fatherly guilt, the only way I knew how. I bought them a breathtaking $6.5 million estate nestled in the most exclusive zip code of Connecticut. It was a sprawling mansion with manicured gardens, a stone driveway, and towering oak doors. It was meant to be her sanctuary, her forever home, a place where she could raise a family in absolute comfort while her old man continued to travel the world to secure their financial future. I thought I had given her a fortress. I never imagined I had purchased her a prison. I decided to return to the United States permanently. I was 75 years old, my bones ached with the fatigue of decades of relentless work, and I wanted nothing more than to spend my remaining years watching my daughter smile. I did not tell anyone I was coming. I wanted it to be the ultimate surprise. I took a private car from the airport directly to the estate on a crisp Tuesday morning. The neighborhood was silent, steeped in that heavy, expensive tranquility that only immense wealth can buy. As I walked up the long, sweeping stone driveway, gripping the handle of my travel bag, my heart swelled with anticipation. But that anticipation violently shattered into a million jagged pieces when I saw the figure kneeling on the ground near the grand entrance. It was a woman frail and alarmingly emaciated, wearing a ragged, faded gray uniform that hung off her bony frame like an old sack. She was on her hands and knees on the hard stone pavers, scrubbing the grout with a tiny worn-out toothbrush. Her hair was dull, hanging in greasy strands over her face, and her movements were frantic, almost mechanical. I stopped in my tracks, confused as to why Jared would employ a housekeeper in such a miserable state. I took a step closer, intending to ask her if the family was home. The crunch of my shoes on the gravel made her freeze. She slowly turned her head to look at me, and all the air violently left my lungs. Beneath the dirt, beneath the hollow, sunken cheeks and the dark, bruised circles under her eyes, was the face of my little girl. It was Rachel. But the light in her eyes, the vibrant, joyful spark that had always defined her, was completely extinguished. She looked at me with sheer, unadulterated terror. She did not see her father. She saw a threat. I dropped my bag. The heavy thud echoed in the quiet morning air. I took a hesitant step forward, my hands trembling uncontrollably. I whispered her name, my voice cracking under the weight of a shock so profound it felt like a physical blow to my chest. Rachel scrambled backward, her hands scraping against the rough stone. She pressed her back against one of the massive concrete pillars, pulling her knees to her chest. "Please, sir," she whimpered, her voice raspy and broken. "Please do not tell Mr. Lawson. I am almost done. I promise I will not miss a spot. Please do not tell him. I am scrubbing it clean." My heart completely shattered. I fell to my knees right there on the driveway, reaching out to her. "Rachel, sweetheart, it is me. It is Dad. I am home." I tried to gently touch her shoulder, hoping the physical contact would snap her out of whatever nightmare she was trapped in. But the moment my fingers brushed her coarse uniform, she violently recoiled, letting out a stifled, agonizing gasp. She completely failed to recognize me. There was no flicker of memory, no softening of her expression. She was lost in a dense, suffocating cognitive fog, exhibiting a severe trauma response that I had only ever read about in war veterans. She buried her face in her hands, and began to rock back and forth, chanting apologies to a man she referred to only as Mr. Lawson. Before I could even attempt to calm her down, the heavy oak doors of the mansion swung open. The sound was like a gunshot. Jared Lawson stepped out onto the portico. He looked entirely different from the modest, eager young man who had asked for my daughter's hand all those years ago. He was wearing a custom-tailored Italian suit, an expensive gold watch gleaming on his wrist, his hair perfectly styled. He looked like the master of the universe. Flanking him was a glamorous, remarkably younger woman with striking features wearing a tight designer dress and holding a clipboard. Jared looked down at me kneeling on the driveway, and for a fraction of a second I saw raw, naked panic flash across his face. But he was a master manipulator, and the panic vanished just as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a mask of profound, tragic sorrow. "Anthony," he gasped, rushing down the steps. "Oh my God, Anthony, you are here." I stood up, my fists clenched at my sides, my eyes darting between him and my trembling daughter on the ground. "What is going on here?" I demanded, my voice low and shaking with a fury I had never known before. "Why is my daughter dressed like a slave? Why does she not know who I am? Who is this woman?" Jared quickly gestured to the younger woman, who stepped forward with a practiced, sympathetic smile. "Anthony, please, this is Vanessa. She is Rachel's live-in nurse. Come inside. Please let me explain everything." Jared reached down, not to help Rachel up gently, but grabbing her strictly by the upper arm, hauling her to her feet with a subtle but aggressive yank. Rachel kept her head bowed, staring at the pavement, entirely submissive. Jared ushered me into the grand foyer of the home I had purchased. The interior was lavishly decorated, completely remodeled since I had last seen it, reeking of new money and excessive indulgence. He guided me into his private, closing the heavy doors behind us to muffle the sounds of the house. He gestured for me to sit in a leather armchair, pouring a glass of expensive scotch and pushing it across the desk toward me. He sat down heavily, burying his face in his hands, performing the role of a devastated husband with sickening perfection. "Anthony, I am so incredibly sorry." He began, his voice hushed and trembling with fake emotion. "I did not know how to tell you. I did not know how to break your heart from thousands of miles away. 5 years ago, Rachel was in a terrible car accident. She was driving on the highway in the rain, a truck lost control, and she was run off the road. She suffered a severe traumatic brain injury." I stared at him, the scotch untouched. "A brain injury for 5 years. Why was I never called? Why was I never told? My only child was in the hospital." Jared wiped a non-existent tear from his eye. "She was in a coma for weeks, Anthony. When she finally woke up, the damage was catastrophic. She suffered from profound amnesia and severe cognitive regression. The vibrant woman we both loved was gone. The doctors told me that her brain rewrote its own pathways to cope with the trauma. She developed violent, uncontrollable panic attacks. She would scream, break things, hurt herself. It was a nightmare." I gripped the armrests of my chair, my knuckles turning white. "And that explains why she is on her hands and knees scrubbing the driveway with a toothbrush." Jared nodded solemnly, leaning forward, as if sharing a painful medical necessity. "Yes. The specialists, the very best neurologists I could find, discovered that keeping her occupied with repetitive menial physical chores is the only therapy that grounds her. The physical exertion tires her out and keeps the panic attacks at bay. If she stops working, if we try to treat her normally, her brain overloads and she becomes a danger to herself. Vanessa is here to monitor her routine and make sure she stays calm." "Then why didn't you call me?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. "If my daughter was broken, I should have been here." Jared looked at me with deep, manufactured sympathy. "Because of your heart, Anthony. We all knew about your mild heart attack a few years ago. You were under immense stress building your company." When Rachel briefly regained a moment of clarity before her memory faded completely, she begged me. She grabbed my hand and she insisted that I never let you see her like this. She said the shock would kill you and she would not let her tragedy be the end of your life. I was honoring my wife's dying wish, Anthony. The Rachel we knew is gone. I have dedicated my life to keeping her safe in the only way her broken mind allows. I sat back in the leather chair. I let my shoulders slump. I allowed my face to crumble into an expression of defeated, exhausted grief. I let out a long, ragged sigh, hiding my eyes behind my trembling hands. I played the part of a broken, tired old man who had arrived too late to save his little girl. I verbally accepted his tragic story, nodding slowly, murmuring my thanks to him for carrying such a heavy burden alone. First, there was Vanessa. When she had stood in the doorway, the light had caught the jewelry hanging from her ears. They were flawless 2-carat diamond teardrop earrings. I recognized them immediately because I had custom commissioned them in Antwerp and gifted them to Rachel on her 25th birthday. A live-in nurse does not wear the incapacitated patient's priceless family heirlooms on a Tuesday morning. Second, there was the condition of Rachel's hands. When I had knelt beside her on the driveway, I saw her fingers. They were brutalized. Her skin was thick with yellow calluses, her nails cracked and bleeding at the cuticles, her joints swollen. Those were not the hands of a woman undergoing therapeutic monitored chores to soothe her anxiety. Those were the hands of a woman who had been subjected to years of relentless, grueling, hard labor without proper care or protection. But the most damning piece of evidence was not physical. It was psychological. When Jared had opened the front door, his voice had naturally boomed across the portico. He had not yelled, but the mere sudden elevation in his tone had caused Rachel to react instantly. She had cowered, pulling her shoulders up to her ears and curling inward like a beaten dog anticipating a strike. A woman suffering from amnesia might be confused or frightened by strangers, but that specific, instinctive flinch was not a symptom of brain trauma. It was the undeniable symptom of prolonged systematic abuse. She was not grounded by her chores. She was terrified of the man standing over her. I sat in that heavy leather chair in Jared's study and let my shoulders collapse. I forced my breathing to become shallow and ragged. I am 75 years old, so looking frail does not require a massive leap of imagination, but I had to sell the performance of a lifetime. I brought my trembling hands up to my face and let out a dry, broken sob. I allowed real tears to form, pulling from the genuine agony of seeing my daughter on her hands and knees out on that driveway. But the tears I shed in front of Jared were not tears of defeat. They were the camouflage of a predator. Jared poured another glass of scotch and walked around the massive mahogany desk. He placed a heavy, comforting hand on my shoulder. He gave it a gentle squeeze, playing the role of the devoted, exhausted caretaker to absolute perfection. "It is all right, Anthony," he murmured, his voice dripping with fabricated sympathy. "I know this is a terrible shock. We did not want to burden you. We wanted you to remember Rachel as she was beautiful and full of life." I nodded slowly, keeping my face buried in my hands. "I am a failure," I whispered, letting my voice crack perfectly on the final syllable. "I spent all those years overseas building wealth, building an empire, and I was not even here when my own flesh and blood needed me the most. I should have been here, Jared. I should have been here to protect her. You could not have stopped the truck from hitting her, Anthony. It was a tragic accident. No one is to blame." Jared's voice was smooth, practiced. He had likely rehearsed this exact conversation in front of a mirror 1,000 times. Preparing for the day, the old man finally came home. I wiped my eyes with the back of my hand and looked up at him. I made sure my expression was vacant, completely devoid of the sharp corporate instinct that had made me a billionaire. Jared looked back at me, and beneath his mask of sorrow, I could see the unmistakable gleam of triumph. He thought he had completely neutralized the threat. He thought I was just a tired, broken retiree with a weak heart, ready to write a blank check out of guilt and disappear into the background. "I cannot stay here," I said, allowing my hands to shake as I gripped the armrests of the chair. "I cannot sleep under this roof, Jared. Knowing she is out there scrubbing the stones, not even knowing my name, my heart cannot take it." The doctor warned me about stress. If I stay here tonight, I am afraid I might not wake up tomorrow. Are you sure, Anthony? He asked, stepping back slightly. We have the guest wing entirely prepared. You are family. You belong here with us. We can manage her routine so you do not have to see the difficult parts. No, I insisted, slowly pushing myself out of the chair. My knees popped, adding to the illusion of my frailty. I need a quiet place. A hotel. I need to process this alone. I will go into town, check into the plaza, and rest. I just need a few days to gather my strength before I can face her again. Jared nodded solemnly, acting as if he were honoring a dying man's wish. He walked me out of the sea and led me toward the grand foyer. As we walked through the opulent hallway, I kept my eyes fixed on the imported marble floors, but my peripheral vision caught everything. The expensive modern art on the walls, the custom silk draperies, the sheer amount of money bleeding from every corner of the house. This estate was purchased to be a family home, not a palace of excess. I caught one final glimpse of Rachel through the glass doors leading to the courtyard. She was still on her hands and knees, scrubbing the same spot, moving with that terrified mechanical rhythm. Vanessa was standing nearby, leaning against a pillar, scrolling on her phone, wearing my daughter's diamond earrings. It took every ounce of willpower I possessed not to march through those doors and wrap my hands around Jared's throat. But anger is the enemy of strategy. I had to remain cold. Jared walked me to my waiting car. He embraced me gently, promising to call me the moment Rachel was calm enough for a short visit. I thanked him weakly, climbed into the back seat, and told the driver to take me to the Grand Hotel in the center of town. I stared out the tinted window as the car rolled down the driveway, watching Jared stand on the portico, waving a sad goodbye. The moment the iron gates of the estate closed behind the car, my entire posture shifted. I stopped slouching. My hands stopped trembling. The facade of the broken, grieving father vanished into the cold air. I pulled out my phone and began typing out mental notes, locking away every detail, every discrepancy, every piece of evidence I had gathered in those agonizing 30 minutes. I checked into the penthouse suite of the hotel under a corporate alias I frequently used for secure business travel. The suite was expansive, soundproof, and secure. The moment the heavy wooden door clicked shut behind me, I walked into the marble bathroom and splashed ice-cold water on my face. I looked at myself in the mirror. I was older, yes. My hair was gray, and the lines on my face told the story of a lifetime of grueling negotiations and sleepless nights. But my eyes were sharp. The fire that had driven me to conquer international markets was not extinguished. It was burning brighter and hotter than it ever had before. Later that afternoon, I needed to observe the perimeter. I needed to understand the daily operations of the estate without being seen. I rented an unassuming black sedan, parked it 3 blocks down from the estate gates, and waited in the shadow of a massive elm tree. I had spent hours doing this exact kind of surveillance when scouting rival logistics hubs in Europe. Patience is a weapon, and I have always possessed an abundance of it. I sat in the silence of the car, watching the heavy iron gates of my daughter's property. Around 4 in the afternoon, the gates slowly swung open. A deep, aggressive engine roar shattered the quiet neighborhood. A brand-new custom-ordered Porsche Panamera glided out onto the street. The car was painted a sleek metallic charcoal, gleaming in the afternoon sun. I raised a pair of compact binoculars to my eyes. Jared was behind the wheel. He had changed out of his suit and was wearing expensive casual clothes, a pair of designer sunglasses resting on his face. He was laughing, talking animatedly through the car's Bluetooth system. He looked completely carefree, a man without a single worry in the world, living the absolute dream. I lowered the binoculars, my jaw clenched so tight my teeth ached. I know exactly how much a custom Porsche costs. I also know exactly how much Jared Lawson made as a mid-level marketing director before he married my daughter. He did not buy that car with his salary. 16 years ago, I established an irrevocable trust for Rachel. It was designed to cover the property taxes, the estate maintenance, and provide a substantial, comfortable living allowance for my daughter's future family. It was a fortress of financial security holding millions of dollars. The money was meant to guarantee her peace of mind, not to fund a fleet of exotic sports cars for a man who kept her scrubbing stone pavers like a prisoner. I watched the taillights of the Porsche disappear down the winding road. Jared thought he had outsmarted me. He thought he had successfully gaslit a tired old man into funding his lavish lifestyle and his glamorous mistress. But he had made a fatal miscalculation. He forgot who he was stealing from. He forgot whose money he was spending. And most importantly, he forgot whose daughter he had locked away. I sat alone in the center of the sprawling hotel suite. The silence in the room was absolute and heavy. I watched the city lights flicker to life through the expansive floor-to-ceiling windows. Just an hour ago, I had watched the man who married my daughter drive away in a luxury vehicle bought with my stolen money. I knew I needed to move fast, and I needed to move without leaving a single trace. I opened my leather travel bag and reached deeply into the hidden bottom compartment. I pulled out a prepaid encrypted cell phone. In my line of work, navigating shipping lanes in hostile foreign territories, you learn to never use a primary network when you are about to start a war. I powered the device on and waited for the secure connection to establish. There was only one number programmed into the memory of that phone. It belonged to Stephen Blackwood. Stephen was not a family lawyer or a friendly estate planner. He was a corporate executioner. Before entering the private sector, he had spent 15 years as a federal prosecutor, dismantling organized crime syndicates and exposing massive financial frauds. He was ruthless and methodical, and he possessed a mind like a steel trap. He had been my primary legal counsel and my closest confidant for over 2 decades. I trusted him with my global empire, and now I had to trust him with the life of my daughter. I pressed the call button and held the cold phone to my ear. It rang twice before he answered. He recognized my encrypted line immediately. I told him I was back in the United States and that we had a catastrophic situation on our hands. His tone remained perfectly level as he asked me to explain exactly what had happened. I took a deep breath and told him everything. I described the ragged maid uniform and the frantic scrubbing of the stone pavers. I told him about the hollow, terrified look in Rachel's eyes and the heartbreaking flinch she made when Jared simply raised his voice. I detailed the glamorous mistress parading around the grand foyer, wearing my daughter's custom diamond earrings. I told him about the brand-new sports car gliding out of the driveway. Stephen did not interrupt me once. He listened in absolute silence as I laid out the nightmare I had unknowingly walked into. When I finally finished speaking, I expected him to express shock or perhaps offer sympathy. Instead, he immediately shifted into a cold, tactical mode. He asked me if Jared knew I was suspicious. I assured him that Jared firmly believed I was just a broken and grieving old man who had swallowed his pathetic story about a tragic car accident and severe brain trauma. Stephen told me that was exactly the dynamic we needed to maintain. He said we currently possessed this element of surprise, which is the most lethal weapon in any investigation. I instructed Stephen to begin a forensic audit of the trust immediately. 16 years earlier, I had designed it to protect Rachel, not to hand any spouse a blank check. The principal was protected, but the trust still allowed distributions for Rachel's housing, medical care, maintenance, and support. Major requests normally required documentation, showing that the money was genuinely being used for her benefit, and the structure assumed Rachel would remain capable of participating in those decisions. That was the weakness Jared could have exploited. Stephen explained that a conservatorship would not magically rewrite the trust or make Jared owner of the principal. It could, however, allow him to act in Rachel's name, certify care expenses, submit distribution requests, and present court-backed authority to institutions that would otherwise insist on Rachel's personal approval. If he paired that authority with sham vendors' false medical needs, inflated property expenses, or misleading support records, millions could leave the trust while each transaction appeared supported by paperwork. The fraud would not look like someone breaking into a vault. It would look like a husband submitting invoices for a wife. A court had already declared incapable of objecting. I told Stephen to determine which distributions had been approved, what justification accompanied them, and where the money went after it left the trust. If Jared had converted a protective structure into his funding source, the accounting trail would show it. Stephen told me his forensic team would begin that night, but he was careful about how they would work. He was not going to invent secret subpoenas or pull private banking records simply because we were angry. He would start with the trust instruments accounting rights already built into the fund, public corporate filings connected to receiving entities, and any probate records that changed Rachel's legal authority. If those records justified formal discovery, he would seek it through the court. I gave him the questions that mattered. When did the abnormal distributions begin? Which entities received them? Who controlled those entities? What authority was presented before each major transfer? Had Jared obtained any conservatorship or guardianship order, allowing him to act without Rachel? Stephen said his accountants could map the history quietly. Routine accounting requests would go through counsel, and he would examine the public docket before anyone contacted the household. I also asked him to look into Vanessa, but not to assume what her role was until the records supported it. Stephen warned me not to contact the trust administrator myself. A sudden emotional inquiry from Rachel's father could trigger ordinary notifications that eventually reached Jared. He would move one verified step at a time. That was exactly what I wanted. No noise, no threats, just the records. Stephen's first report would come only after the records agreed with one another. Until then, Jared would see nothing except the grieving father he had already dismissed. Before we ended the call, Stephen paused and asked me how I was holding up personally. For a brief moment, the heavy armor of the corporate titan cracked, and I was just a terrified father standing alone in a hotel room. I told him my heart was completely shattered. I told him the image of my beautiful daughter cowering like a beaten animal on the driveway was burned into my mind and playing on an endless loop. But then the armor locked firmly back into place. I told Stephen that I was not going to let this grief destroy me. I told him I was going to use every dollar I possessed and every connection I had and every ounce of power I had accumulated over my lifetime to crush Jared Lawson into dust. The morning sun was bright, but it offered absolutely no warmth to the cold precision settling into my bones. I had spent the early hours coordinating with my private corporate security team back in Singapore. I did not ask for local private investigators who might leave a paper trail. I utilized my own network. By 10 o'clock, a discreet courier had delivered a sealed metallic briefcase to my hotel suite. Inside was the exact equipment I requested. Micro cameras no larger than the head of a pin, and audio receivers sophisticated enough to pick up a muted whisper from across a crowded room. These were the tools of corporate espionage, and today I was deploying them inside my own family. I slipped the tiny devices into the deep pockets of my tweed jacket. I needed a flawless pretext to enter the estate and roam freely. I drove to an upscale botanical nursery and purchased 4 pots of rare blue hydrangeas. They were Rachel's absolute favorite flowers when she was a little girl. I drove my unremarkable rental car back to the sprawling estate. I knew Jared was gone. I had watched him leave in his stolen luxury sports car, just as Stephen and I anticipated. I parked near the grand entrance and carried the heavy terracotta pots up the stone steps. I rang the doorbell and forced my posture to collapse. I let my shoulders hunch and my hands tremble just slightly. When the heavy oak doors swung open, Vanessa stood there. She was wearing a silk robe that I recognized from a designer boutique in Paris, holding a steaming mug of coffee. She looked at me with undisguised irritation. I put on my best fragile smile and spoke with a wavering voice. I told her I brought these hydrangeas for my sweet Rachel. I told her the doctors always say familiar scents and sights can trigger positive memories in patients with severe brain trauma. I begged her to let me plant them in the backyard, just to feel like I was doing something useful for my sick child. Vanessa let out a long, dramatic sigh and rolled her eyes. She clearly viewed me as a pathetic nuisance, but she also believed I was completely harmless. She stepped aside and waved her manicured hand toward the back of the house, telling me to make it quick and not to track dirt onto the imported rugs. I thanked her profusely, bowing my head like a subservient beggar. I walked through the opulent corridors holding the heavy pots. I found Rachel in the expansive backyard. She was on her knees in the damp soil, aggressively pulling weeds with her bare, brutalized hands. My heart seized in my chest. I wanted to drop the flowers and run to her and carry her away from this nightmare. But I knew if I acted too soon, Jared would lawyer up and hide the assets. I had to remain focused on the long game. I knelt in the dirt, a few feet away from my daughter. I spoke to her softly, telling her I was planting her favorite blue flowers. Rachel did not look at me. She just kept yanking the weeds, muttering under her breath that Mr. Lawson hated weeds, and she had to finish before he returned. The sheer terror in her voice was a physical weight on my soul. I looked back toward the patio. Vanessa had stretched out on a luxury lounge chair, wearing designer sunglasses and aggressively tapping on her cell phone screen. She was completely ignoring us. This was my moment. I stood up slowly, groaning as if my joints were failing me. I walked over to the patio and apologetically interrupted Vanessa. I told her my chest was feeling very tight, and I desperately needed a glass of water to take my heart medication. I asked her if she could be so kind as to fetch one for me. Vanessa scoffed loudly, not even bothering to hide her disdain for my weakness. She told me she was not a waitress and pointed a perfectly polished fingernail toward the sliding glass doors. She told me the kitchen was down the hall to the left, and I could get it myself. It was the exact arrogant miscalculation I was counting on. She handed me the keys to the castle simply because she was too lazy to get out of her chair. I thanked her profusely and shuffled inside the house. The moment the glass doors slid shut behind me, my frail shuffle vanished. I moved through the lavish house with swift, silent purpose. I entered the massive gourmet kitchen. It was immaculate and cold. I reached into my pocket and retrieved the first audio node. I ran my fingers along the underside of the massive marble island, finding a hidden groove near the bar stools where people would naturally gather to talk. I pressed the adhesive backing firmly into place. The kitchen was compromised. I quickly filled a crystal glass with water to maintain my cover story and moved seamlessly into the grand living room. The ceiling vaulted 20 feet high with massive windows overlooking the front lawn. I needed a vantage that captured the entire space. I walked over to the towering custom-built bookcase that flanked the fireplace. I pulled a microscopic camera from my pocket and wedged it perfectly into the intricate wooden molding near the top shelf. The lens was completely invisible to the naked eye, but it provided a sweeping, unobstructed view of the sofas and the main entryway. If Jared brought anyone into this house or discussed his plans openly in the living room, I would see and hear every single second of it. But the kitchen and the living room were not enough. I needed to infiltrate the heart of their deception. I needed the master bedroom. I left the glass of water on the dining table and moved to the grand staircase. I climbed the carpeted steps 2 at a time, making absolutely no sound. I reached the second-floor landing and pushed open the double doors of the master suite. The sight inside made my stomach turn. This was supposed to be the room I bought for my daughter. Instead, it had been entirely conquered by the mistress. Vanessa had scattered her expensive designer clothing across the velvet armchairs. High-end imported cosmetics cluttered the vanity. There was absolutely no trace of Rachel in this room. My daughter had been banished from her own sanctuary. I refused to let anger cloud my efficiency. I approached the bedside tables. I needed an audience where they felt most secure, whispering their darkest secrets in the dead of night. I placed an audio receiver deep inside the air conditioning vent, directly above the massive king-sized bed. Then I moved to a heavy decorative lamp resting on a dresser across the room. I slid the second micro camera behind the dark tinted glass base of the lamp, ensuring the lens had a clear view of the entire room. I had just secured the final device when I heard the sharp click of high heels on the hardwood floor. downstairs. Vanessa was coming inside. I moved with lightning speed. I slipped out of the master bedroom, pulling the doors shut just as I heard her footsteps start up the grand staircase. I ducked into the guest bathroom adjacent to the stairs and immediately turned on the faucet. I splashed water on my face and began breathing heavily. Vanessa pushed the bathroom door open a crack, looking annoyed. She demanded to know what was taking me so long. I leaned over the sink, clutching my chest, and told her my heart palpitations were acting up again, and I just needed a moment to catch my breath in the cool air. I apologized for wandering upstairs, saying I had gotten turned around looking for a restroom. She rolled her eyes, muttering something about old people being a massive liability. She told me to drink my water and get out of the house because Jared would be home soon, and he did not like unannounced visitors disrupting the schedule. I nodded submissively, drying my hands on a plush towel. I slowly descended the stairs, retrieving my half-empty glass of water from the dining room along the way to sell the lie. I walked out the front door, leaving Vanessa standing in the foyer, looking thoroughly irritated by my existence. I sat in the quiet isolation of my hotel suite, staring out at the city lights. The burner phone resting on the glass coffee table felt like a live grenade. The tiny red light on my laptop screen indicated that the hidden cameras were recording back at the estate, but my mind was solely focused on the phone. It was past midnight. Stephen Blackwood had promised me an update before the night was over, and Stephen was a man who never broke a promise. When the encrypted device finally buzzed, vibrating violently against the glass, I snatched it up before the second ring. Stephen did not bother with pleasantries. His voice was gravelly, carrying the unmistakable weight of a man who had spent the last 15 years staring into the abyss of human greed. He told me to sit down. I told him I was already seated and to give it to me straight. I had spent decades dealing with corporate vultures, hostile takeovers, and supply chain sabotage. I thought my skin was thick enough to handle whatever financial mismanagement he had uncovered. I was wrong. What Stephen laid out over the next hour was not mere theft. It was the absolute systematic dismantling of my daughter's existence. Stephen started with the money. 16 years ago, I had funded Rachel's irrevocable trust with $12 million. It was designed to grow, paying out carefully managed dividends. Stephen and his forensic team had cracked the ledger. For the first 11 years, the trust operated exactly as I had designed it. But exactly 5 years ago, the architecture of the fund was violently altered. Stephen explained that massive irregular wire transfers began bleeding out of the principal. We were not talking about a few $1,000s here and there for luxury cars or designer clothes. We were talking about millions. Stephen traced the wires. The funds were being systematically siphoned out of Connecticut, bounced through a series of nested corporate accounts in Delaware, and eventually funneled into 3 offshore limited liability companies registered in the Cayman Islands. I asked Stephen whose names were on the operating agreements for those offshore entities. Stephen paused for a fraction of a second. The shell companies were registered exclusively under the name Jared Lawson. My son-in-law had quietly transferred over $7 million in untraceable assets directly into his own pockets. He was preparing an exit strategy. He was building an absolute fortune using the very money I had bled to secure my daughter's future. My chest tightened as a cold, paralyzing fury washed over me. I demanded to know how Jared had bypassed the bank security protocols. The trust required Rachel's physical signature and a notarized presence for any transfer exceeding $50,000. I knew Rachel. She would never authorize those offshore movements. She did not care about offshore shell companies. I asked Stephen if Jared was forging her signature. I expected Stephen to say yes, that we were looking at simple wire fraud. Instead, the line went dead silent for a moment. Stephen took a deep breath. His voice dropped an octave, shifting from the tone of a corporate accountant to the tone of a federal prosecutor holding a smoking gun. He told me that Jared did not need to forge her signature because legally Rachel's signature no longer existed. My mind ground to a halt. I asked him to explain what he meant. Stephen revealed the second half of his investigation. While tracing the banking authorizations, his team uncovered a sealed court order filed in a remote probate court exactly 5 years ago. Jared had petitioned a judge for full permanent conservatorship over my daughter. Stephen read the summary of the court docket over the phone. Jared had submitted a mountain of medical affidavits claiming that Rachel had suffered catastrophic brain damage. The paperwork asserted that she lacked the basic cognitive capacity to feed herself, clothe herself, or comprehend financial matters. Jared painted himself as the devoted self-sacrificing husband willing to manage her estate to ensure her lifelong care. The judge granted the petition without a single objection. Rachel was stripped of all her civil liberties. She was declared entirely mentally incompetent. I felt the air being sucked out of the room. I felt physically sick. A conservatorship is a legal mechanism designed to protect the elderly or the profoundly disabled. But in Jared's hands, it was a weapon of mass destruction. By securing that court order, Jared effectively erased Rachel from the eyes of the law. She could not vote. She could not hold a passport. She could not hire a lawyer. She could not even access a single dollar of her own money to buy a cup of coffee. Jared became her sole legal guardian. He became the undisputed master of her trust, her home, and her body. I asked Stephen about the medical affidavits supporting the conservatorship. A court does not normally strip an adult of financial control based on a spouse's story alone. Someone had signed medical papers describing Rachel as catastrophically impaired. Stephen confirmed it. The petition included a lengthy evaluation from a private physician. On paper, the report described severe memory loss, inability to manage basic needs, and permanent cognitive decline. The problem was not what the report said. The problem was what was missing around it. Stephen had not yet found the ordinary trail that should surround the kind of accident Jared described to me. There were no obvious hospital records attached to the probate filing. No rehabilitation history in the materials he had reviewed, and no independent specialist records supporting the dramatic diagnosis. He stopped me before I could declare the accident fake. "We are not there yet," he said. That restraint mattered. The financial audit had proven that millions were moving away from Rachel. The court docket had proven that Jared obtained legal control over her. It had not yet proven how he obtained the medical evidence, or whether every part of the accident story was fabricated. Stephen's investigators were now checking the physician's license history, financial condition, and connection to Jared. They were also requesting and reviewing lawful records that could confirm whether a major highway collision emergency transport, hospitalization, or insurance claim ever existed. I looked again at the conservatorship order on my screen. The date still made my stomach turn. 5 years earlier. The same period when the trust began bleeding money. The same period when Rachel vanished from public life. The same period Jared claimed she lost her memory. I told Stephen what I had seen on the driveway, the terror, the vacant eyes, the broken hands, the automatic cowering whenever Jared's voice changed. Whatever had happened to Rachel, her condition was real. The question was whether Jared had caused it, and then used that condition to justify the legal control he wanted. Stephen told me not to confront him. If we attacked the conservatorship with financial discrepancies alone, Jared could claim the offshore entities were investments made for Rachel's benefit. More dangerously, he could use the existing order to move her into a private facility while the court challenge was pending. We needed evidence of abuse that existed outside the paper trail. That was why the surveillance mattered. I told Stephen the devices were already transmitting from the estate. There was a brief silence. Then he said, "Document what is happening to her now. I will build the legal route around whatever the evidence proves." I ended the call and stared at the court order until the words blurred. Jared had not simply stolen access to Rachel's trust. He had wrapped his control in a judicial order. To break that order, I would have to prove that the reality inside the house was the exact opposite of the story he had sold to the court. The order did not make Jared untouchable. It made precision essential. He had spent 5 years building a paper fortress around my daughter. I would not attack it with rage. I would remove it one verified document at a time. The glow of the laptop screen was the only light in my hotel suite. It cast a pale blue shadow across the dark mahogany desk where I sat completely motionless. The city outside my window was quiet, but my blood was roaring in my ears. I had connected the secure software Stephen provided to the micro cameras I had planted earlier that afternoon. I stared at the high-definition feed, broadcasting live from the master bedroom of the estate I had purchased for my daughter. The camera I had hidden behind the dark glass base of the decorative lamp provided a flawless panoramic view of the room. The audio receiver tucked inside the air conditioning vent picked up every rustle of fabric and every footstep with terrifying clarity. I was a ghost haunting the very house my money had built, and I was waiting for the monsters to show their true faces. The heavy double doors of the master suite swung open. Jared walked into the room, loosening the silk tie around his neck. Vanessa followed close behind him, carrying 2 crystal glasses filled with expensive champagne. This was not the behavior of a devoted husband seeking comfort from a hired medical professional after a grueling day of caring for his brain-damaged wife. Vanessa kicked off her designer heels and collapsed onto the massive king-sized bed, sinking into the plush duvet. She let out a loud, dramatic sigh of relief. Jared walked over to her, taking one of the champagne glasses. He sat on the edge of the bed and leaned down, kissing her deeply. It was a kiss of profound, familiar intimacy. There was no hesitation between them. Vanessa was not just an opportunistic nurse hired to maintain a medical lie. She was his longtime mistress, comfortably reigning over the kingdom they had stolen from my little girl. I gripped the edge of the desk so tightly, my knuckles ached. I forced myself to keep watching. I had to hear every word. Jared took a long sip of his drink and let out a cruel, booming laugh. It echoed through my laptop speakers like a physical blow. "Did you see the old fool today?" he asked, his voice dripping with absolute contempt. "Did you see him crying on the couch in my study?" He swallowed the entire story without a single question. I told him she was in a car crash, and his brain just shut down. He was shaking like a leaf. I thought his weak heart was going to give out right there on the rug. Vanessa laughed, a sharp, grating sound that made my stomach turn. She rolled onto her side, propping herself up on her elbow. "I honestly thought he would put up more of a fight," she said, swirling the champagne in her glass. "You were so worried he would demand to see hospital records or bring his own doctors. But he just folded. He is pathetic, Jared. He handed you the keys to the kingdom, and now he is probably crying himself to sleep in some hotel room. He is completely harmless." Jared smirked and leaned back against the headboard. "He is worse than harmless, Vanessa. He is a walking ATM. The moment he leaves town, I am going to call him and tell him the medical bills for her specialized therapy are increasing. He will wire us another $100,000 just to ease his own miserable guilt. He thinks he is a titan of industry, but he is just a dinosaur. He does not have the stomach for this kind of game." Vanessa finished her drink and placed the empty glass heavily on the bedside table. Her smile faded, replaced by a deep, ugly scowl. Her tone shifted from amusement to harsh irritation. "Well, I am glad the old man is out of the way," she snapped. "But we need to talk about the real problem. I am losing my patience, Jared. I am sick of looking at her. I am sick of stepping over her in the hallway." Jared sighed, rubbing his temples as if he were the one suffering. "I know, baby. I know it is difficult to see her crawling around." "It is not just difficult," Vanessa interrupted, her voice rising in shrill anger. "It is repulsive. She ruins the aesthetic of this entire house. I spend hours picking out custom furniture and ordering imported rugs, and then I have to walk downstairs and see your pathetic wife scrubbing the baseboards looking like a filthy stray animal. It is depressing. I cannot even invite my friends over for brunch because I am terrified she will have one of her drug-induced panic attacks and start screaming in the kitchen. I want her gone, Jared. I want her out of my sight." Jared reached out and stroked Vanessa's hair, attempting to soothe her mounting temper. "You have to be patient." "Just a little bit longer," he promised, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "You know why we keep her here. The conservatorship requires me to maintain a primary residence for her care. If I ship her off to a facility right now, the state might assign an independent auditor to review her trust fund to cover the medical costs. We cannot risk an outside accountant looking at the books while I am still moving the assets. We have to keep her in the house under our direct control until the offshore accounts are fully funded." Vanessa crossed her arms over her chest, acting like a spoiled child denied a toy. "Well, how much longer, Jared? I cannot do this for another year. I refuse to share my home with a ghost for another 12 months. Jared smiled a cold, calculating smile that made my blood freeze. "You do not have to wait a year," he told her, pulling her close. 6 months. I just need 6 more months. The final transfers to the Cayman Island accounts are already scheduled. Once the last $3 million clear, the international hurdles, the trust will be completely drained. There will be nothing left but empty accounts and paper trails leading to dead ends." Vanessa looked up at him, her greed visibly softening her anger. "And then," what she asked, her eyes gleaming with anticipation. "And then we sell this massive estate," Jared replied smoothly. "We take the cash from the property sale and we leave the country. We can go to the villa in Spain or the penthouse in Dubai. As for Rachel, once the money is gone, I will petition the court to surrender my conservatorship due to financial hardship. The state will be forced to take custody of her. They will drag her out of here and dump her in some underfunded, crowded psychiatric ward. She will just be a ward of the state, heavily medicated and completely forgotten. We will be sipping wine on a private beach, and the old man will be none the wiser until it is far too late." I did not sleep a single second that night. I sat in the dark hotel suite watching the city lights slowly fade into the gray light of dawn. Exactly at 8 in the morning, my encrypted phone vibrated against the glass coffee table. It was Stephen. He did not bother with pleasantries or greetings. He simply stated that he had the medical file and the background check on the physician who had signed away my daughter's freedom. Stephen called at 8 the next morning with the results of the medical background investigation. The physician who had signed the incompetence papers was not a neurologist or a trauma specialist. State licensing records showed disciplinary trouble involving improper prescribing. Financial records obtained through lawful investigative channels also showed severe debt and a long pattern of gambling losses. He was vulnerable. Stephen's team had traced payments from entities connected to Jared into accounts associated with the physician. During the same period, the conservatorship petition was being prepared. The timing was too precise to ignore. The report, in the probate file, described catastrophic neurological damage in technical detail, but Stephen could not find an independent treatment history supporting it. No neurologist appeared to have followed Rachel. No rehabilitation center had treated her for the devastating injuries Jared described. No hospital record matched the alleged weeks-long coma. Then Stephen gave me the result that changed the investigation. There was no documented car accident. His team had checked public accident records, insurance claims, emergency medical billing, and hospital admission information available through authorized requests. Nothing matched Jared's story. No highway collision involving Rachel. No ambulance transport. No intensive care stay. No surgery. The rainy highway, the runaway truck, the coma, all of it had been fabricated. For several seconds, I could not speak. Jared's lie had sounded almost compassionate when he delivered it in his study. He had described himself as a husband, carrying an unbearable burden and protecting an aging father from heartbreak. In reality, the accident story had given him a convenient explanation for Rachel's disappearance and a foundation for the medical paperwork that erased her legal independence. But one question remained. If Rachel had never suffered a traumatic brain injury, why had she looked through me on the driveway without recognizing her own father? I remembered Vanessa in the master bedroom, complaining about Rachel's drug-induced panic attacks. I remembered the delayed movements, the vacant stare, the mechanical obedience, and the terror that appeared before Jared even touched her. She's being drugged, I said. Stephen's answer was immediate. Maybe. We prove it before we say it. He was right. The cameras would stay focused on Rachel's food medication and daily routine. If Jared or Vanessa were chemically suppressing her, I needed the act captured and the substance identified. Stephen would keep the emergency filings ready, but would wait for evidence strong enough to survive the first challenge. The financial theft was already visible. The false accident had now collapsed. The next question was darker. What had Jared done to create the symptoms he used to justify the conservatorship? Stephen also corrected one assumption I had made in anger. The physician's disciplinary history did not mean his license had been non-existent when he signed the report. The filing would not collapse merely because he had a bad reputation. We still had to prove that the evaluation itself was false and that Jared had influenced it. The money trail helped, but it was not yet a confession. Stephen had identified transfers from Jared-controlled entities that coincided with the physician's gambling crisis. He was preserving those records for investigators, not declaring from a hotel room that a bribe had already been proven. That was the standard I needed. Facts first, then consequences, right at 6 in the morning. The kitchen lights flicked on. My breath caught in my throat as Rachel shuffled into the frame. My beautiful, brilliant daughter, who had once run boardrooms and captivated every room she entered, moved like an empty shell. She wore the same ragged gray uniform I had seen the day before. Her shoulders were slumped and her bare feet dragged quietly across the heated tile floor. She moved to the sink, her hands trembling as she began to mechanically scrub the immaculate basin. She was completely alone, but her eyes constantly darted toward the hallway, wide with a permanent haunting terror. 10 minutes later, the sharp, arrogant click of designer slippers echoed through the audio feed. Vanessa strolled into the kitchen wearing a sheer silk robe, her hair perfectly styled, even at this early hour. She did not even acknowledge Rachel as a human being. She walked right past my daughter, treating her like an invisible piece of furniture, and began to prepare a cup of coffee. Rachel immediately stopped scrubbing and pressed her back against the counter, lowering her head in complete submission. I watched the screen, my heart pounding, a heavy, furious rhythm against my ribs. Vanessa finished making her espresso, took a long sip, and then turned her attention to my daughter. She barked an order, telling Rachel to sit at the small wooden table in the corner of the kitchen and wait for her breakfast. Rachel obeyed instantly, moving with a stiff, unnatural gait. She sat down, keeping her hands folded tightly in her lap, staring blankly at the wood grain of the table. Vanessa moved to the pantry. She opened a cabinet high above the ovens, a place completely out of Rachel's line of sight. She reached toward the very back of the top shelf and pulled out a small, unmarked amber prescription bottle. There was no medical label on the plastic. There was no pharmacy sticker, no dosage instructions, no doctor's name. It was completely sterile and anonymous. I leaned closer to the screen, my eyes narrowing. Vanessa unscrewed the child-proof cap and tipped the bottle into her palm. 3 massive, thick, white pills tumbled into her hand. These were not daily vitamins. They were not mild anxiety medications. They were huge, heavy industrial-grade tablets. Vanessa placed the pills into a heavy stone mortar and grabbed the pestle. The sickening sound of stone grinding against stone echoed through my laptop speakers. She crushed the thick white pills until they were reduced to a fine, chalky powder. She then grabbed a bowl from the counter, scooped a large portion of plain, unflavored oatmeal into it, and carelessly scraped the crushed white powder directly into the food. She stirred the mixture aggressively with a silver spoon until the drugs were completely dissolved and invisible within the gray mush. She walked over to the corner table and slammed the heavy bowl down right in front of my daughter. "Eat it," she commanded, her voice laced with absolute venom. "Every last bite. Do not make me call Jared down here." Rachel visibly flinched at the mention of her husband's name. Her trembling, calloused hands reached out and picked up the spoon. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, staring down at the bowl. I could see the faint, deeply buried instinct in her eyes, a subconscious realization that the food in front of her was the source of her endless nightmare. But the terror of disobedience completely overpowered her survival instinct. She lifted the spoon to her mouth and began to eat. She swallowed the poisoned food, bite by agonizing bite, while the woman who had stolen her life leaned against the marble counter, casually sipping her morning espresso and watching her with bored indifference. I sat back in my chair in the darkened hotel room, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the evil I had just witnessed. The final devastating pieces of the puzzle snapped together in my mind with brutal, horrifying clarity. I watched the surveillance feed as the heavy drugs began to take their toll almost immediately. Within 15 minutes, Rachel's posture slumped even further. The rigid terror in her shoulders melted into a frightening slack compliance. Her eyelids drooped heavily and her head lolled forward slightly. The faint spark of fear in her eyes glazed over completely, replaced by a dark, empty void. The tranquilizers had hijacked her nervous system, completely paralyzing her cognitive functions. She was a compliant ghost, ready for another day of silent slave labor. Vanessa grabbed the empty bowl from the table, tossed it into the sink, and ordered Rachel to go clean the guest bathrooms. Rachel stood up slowly, swaying slightly on her feet, and drifted out of the camera's view, swallowed by the dark hallways of the mansion. I slammed my fist down on the desk, the heavy thud echoing in the empty hotel room. The rage that consumed me was no longer a fire. It was absolute freezing, absolute zero. In my 40 years of corporate warfare, I had destroyed men for attempting hostile takeovers. I had bankrupted suppliers for breaching contracts, but those were just business transactions. This was the systematic, calculated destruction of my own flesh and blood. This was attempted murder through slow, deliberate chemical poisoning. The digital clock on my hotel nightstand glowed a harsh, unforgiving red, displaying 2 in the morning. I had not moved from my chair in over 6 hours. My eyes were burning with exhaustion, but I absolutely refused to look away from the surveillance software illuminating my laptop screen. The visual feeds from the kitchen and the majestic living room had gone pitch black long ago. The master bedroom camera showed Vanessa fast asleep with her breathing deep and even under the heavy silk comforter. But Jared was not in the bed. He had slipped out of the room 20 minutes earlier, moving with deliberate stealth. I had my headphones pressed so tightly against my ears that my temples throbbed, listening to the ambient silence of the estate and waiting for the slightest sound to betray his movements. A faint, rhythmic scraping noise began to bleed through the audio receiver I had planted under the kitchen island. It was the distinct sound of bare feet dragging across the cold marble tiles. Then came the heavy, confident footsteps of expensive leather shoes. Jared was leading my daughter through the dark house. I turned the volume and the audio gain on my software up to the absolute maximum. The digital hiss amplified in my ears, making every rustle of fabric terrifyingly intimate. I heard the heavy creak of a solid wooden door opening. It was not a door on the main residential floor. It sounded exactly like the thick, reinforced door leading down to the expansive basement utility room. The acoustics shifted immediately, becoming hollow and echoing as they descended the wooden stairs. I closed my eyes and concentrated entirely on the audio feed, visualizing the descent into the cold, concrete depths of the house I had purchased. Jared snapped at her to pick up her feet. His voice was a harsh, venomous whisper that bounced viciously off the concrete walls of the basement. I heard Rachel let out a weak, breathy whimper. She stumbled, and the sound of her knees hitting the hard floor sent a violent shockwave of physical pain right through my chest. She was heavily sedated with her central nervous system completely drowning in the crushed tranquilizers Vanessa had forced into her morning oatmeal. She could barely stand under normal circumstances, let alone navigate a steep, dark staircase in the middle of the night while heavily drugged. Jared demanded that she get up. The sound of fabric rustling told me he had grabbed her by the collar of her ragged uniform, hauling her to her feet, with zero regard for her fragile bones. He told her to sit in the chair and warned her not to make him tell her twice. A metal folding chair scraped loudly against the concrete floor. I heard Rachel slump heavily into it. Her breathing was ragged, shallow, and terrifyingly labored. She sounded like a woman drowning on dry land. Jared told her he brought her down there because they had some unfinished business. His tone was dripping with absolute authority and cruel amusement. He explained that the doctors missed a few signatures on the secondary portfolio releases. He said the offshore accounts were almost ready, but the Cayman lawyers were demanding a wet signature for the final asset transfer. He sneered that they wanted proof of life and they needed to see her handwriting. Rachel did not respond. The heavy sedatives made it impossible for her to form a coherent sentence. I heard the sharp click of a briefcase opening, followed by the rustle of thick legal parchment being spread out on a metal table. Jared ordered her to pick up the pen. Rachel whispered that she could not. Her voice was so slurred and so profoundly altered by the... She cried that her hands were too heavy and politely begged him to let her rest because she was so tired. Jared hissed that she would sleep when he said she could sleep. He slapped his hand down on the metal table, and the sudden noise acted like a gunshot in the echoing basement. He told her she was going to sign the document exactly where he pointed. He threatened that if she ruined the paperwork with her shaking, he would leave her in that room for 3 days without food. He commanded her again to pick up the pen. I listened to the heartbreaking sound of my daughter, struggling to wrap her brutalized, calloused fingers around a pen. She was whimpering softly, completely broken under his psychological torture. Jared was not just stealing her wealth. He was systematically destroying her soul. He enjoyed the power, and he reveled in the absolute control he held over a woman who had once been the brightest light in my life. Jared commanded her to sign right on the dotted line. I heard the slow, agonizing scratch of the pen against the paper. Jared let out a dark, mocking laugh as he watched her struggle. He told her with a voice dripping with sadistic pleasure that her father had come to visit today. He asked her if she had seen me on the driveway. Rachel let out a small, confused gasp. Jared taunted her, confirming that the great Anthony Wallace had finally decided to show up. He cruelly described how I looked right at her scrubbing the dirt like a stray animal and simply walked away. He lied and said I did not even care. He told her I sat in his study, cried a few pathetic tears, and went back to my fancy hotel. He whispered that I had abandoned her and that nobody was coming to save her. He told her she belonged to him now. My chest heaved. I gripped the edge of my desk so tightly that the wood groaned in protest. Jared was using my fabricated grief as a weapon to sever the last remaining thread of hope in my daughter's medicated mind. He was deliberately breaking her spirit, ensuring she would never find the will to fight back or try to escape. Rachel whispered, completely devoid of emotion, that she had signed it. She politely begged him again to please let her go to sleep. Jared snatched the papers from the table and zipped the briefcase shut with a loud final click. He mocked her, calling her a good girl. Then he coldly announced that because she was so slow today, and because she missed a spot on the driveway, she was going to spend the rest of the night down in the basement. He said it would help her remember the rules of his house. Rachel begged him not to do it. The sedatives could not entirely mask the pure primal panic rising in her throat. She pleaded with him not to leave her in the dark. I heard Jared walk toward the basement stairs, completely ignoring her pleas. His leather shoes clicked rhythmically on the wooden steps. Rachel tried to stand, but her bare feet stumbled on the concrete, and she was far too weak. She collapsed to the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. Jared reached the top of the stairs and paused for a fraction of a second, letting the silence amplify her terror. He callously told her to enjoy the dark. Then came the sound that finally broke the last remaining piece of my humanity. The heavy wooden door slammed shut, followed instantly by the loud metallic slide of a heavy deadbolt locking into place. Jared had locked my daughter in a pitch-black utility room in the bowels of the estate. The audio feed captured her muffled, desperate sobs echoing through the concrete chamber. She was crying out into the void, trapped in a chemical haze, believing her father had abandoned her and believing she would die in that dark room. My fury reached a boiling point, But it did not manifest as shouting or thrown objects. It manifested as pure clinical vengeance. I reached for my encrypted phone and dialed Stephen Blackwood. The phone did not even ring before he answered, because he was awake and waiting for my signal. I told Stephen that the intelligence gathering phase was officially over. We had the audio of the extortion, the false imprisonment, the psychological torture, and the forced signing of legal documents under the influence of unprescribed heavy narcotics. I told him I did not care what federal laws we had to bend, what judges we had to wake up in the middle of the night, or what emergency injunctions he had to file before sunrise. The time for passive observation had completely ended. Stephen asked me for the green light to assemble the tactical extraction team and the private medical personnel. I told him to authorize whatever funds were necessary without limits. We were moving immediately into the intervention phase. I was going to rip Jared Lawson from his stolen throne, strip him of every single asset he thought he controlled, and ensure he spent the rest of his miserable existence locked in a concrete cage far smaller and darker than the one he had forced upon my daughter. The trap was fully set, the evidence was secured, and the absolute destruction of my son-in-law was about to commence. The sunlight filtering through the heavy drapes of my hotel suite offered no comfort. I had been awake for over 48 hours, sustained entirely by black coffee and a freezing, unrelenting rage. My eyes were locked onto the laptop screen, monitoring the high-definition surveillance feeds I had planted inside my daughter's estate. The morning had passed with sickening predictability. I had watched Vanessa force another dose of crushed tranquilizers into Rachel's food, ensuring my daughter remained a compliant, heavily sedated ghost. But as the afternoon rolled in, the dynamic inside the house abruptly shifted. Vanessa left for a shopping trip in the city, taking the stolen luxury sports car. Jared remained behind. He was pacing the grand living room, the camera I had hidden in the bookcase capturing his every move. He was not lounging or sipping expensive scotch. He was moving with a frantic, nervous energy, checking his gold watch every few seconds. He pulled out a disposable cell phone entirely separate from the one he normally used and dialed a number. I immediately maximized the audio gain on my software. The microphone picked up the dial tone and the subsequent click of the call connecting. The voice on the other end belonged to a shady real estate broker Stephen had briefly identified during our background checks. The broker was notorious in certain dark circles for liquidating high-value assets quickly, quietly, and entirely off the market for clients who needed to disappear. Jared did not bother with greetings. He demanded to know the status of the wire transfers. His voice was tight, completely stripped of the smooth, arrogant charm he used when performing for me. The broker's voice echoed through the speakerphone, thick with impatience. The broker told Jared that moving millions of dollars in a matter of days required accepting significant losses. He stated he had a private foreign buyer willing to purchase the entire estate sight unseen, completely entirely under the table. But the buyer was only offering $4.8 million in cash, well below the appraised value of $6.5 million. I expected Jared to argue or negotiate. Instead, he let out a harsh breath of relief. He told the broker to accept the $4.8 million immediately. He insisted that the total sum must be wired directly into the nested Cayman Islands shell accounts by Friday morning. I stared at the digital clock on my computer screen. Friday morning was exactly 72 hours away. Jared was not planning to wait 6 months as he had promised his mistress the night before. He was accelerating his timeline. He was cutting his losses, grabbing whatever cash he could secure, and preparing to vanish. The broker cautioned him, warning that expediting the international wire would raise red flags if the paperwork was not perfectly sanitized. He then asked the question that made my blood run absolutely cold. He asked Jared what he intended to do about the loose end living in the house. He was referring to Rachel. Jared let out a dark, hollow laugh that echoed terribly across the empty living room. He told the broker not to worry about his wife, because the conservatorship provided the perfect exit strategy. Jared detailed his master plan with a casual cruelty that defied human comprehension. He explained that once the $4.8 million cleared the offshore accounts on Friday morning, he and Vanessa were driving straight to a private airfield. They had a chartered flight waiting to take them to a jurisdiction with absolutely no extradition treaties. But it was his plan for my daughter that shattered the last remaining fragment of my patience. Jared explained that before he left for the airfield, he was going to lock Rachel in the windowless basement utility room. He would administer a double dose of the antipsychotic tranquilizers, ensuring she would remain completely incapacitated for days. From the safety of his private jet, he planned to file an emergency electronic petition with the state probate court. He would legally surrender his conservatorship, claiming sudden catastrophic financial ruin, and stating that he could no longer afford the specialized care his profoundly brain-damaged wife required. Jared bragged to the broker about the absolute genius of his deception. He said that by the time the state authorities received the petition and dispatched a welfare check to the estate, he and Vanessa would be thousands of miles away, completely untouchable. The state workers would break into the house and find my daughter locked in the basement, heavily drugged, terrified, and completely unable to articulate her own name. Jared gleefully painted a picture of Rachel's final destination. Because she was legally classified as severely incompetent and had no visible financial assets left to her name, the state would immediately declare her a ward of the government. They would not send her to a private, comfortable rehabilitation center. They would drag her out of the only home she knew and abandon her in an overcrowded, underfunded state-run psychiatric ward. Jared sneered that she would spend the rest of her miserable life trapped in a clinical white room restrained by chemical straitjackets, surrounded by strangers who would treat her like a discarded burden. He said she would be utterly forgotten, a medical anomaly, who could never piece together enough of her own memory to testify against him. The audio feed captured Jared ending the call. He tossed the burner phone onto the plush sofa and let out a long, victorious sigh. He walked over to the custom bar cart, poured himself a generous measure of my expensive bourbon, and raised his glass to the empty room. He was toasting to his impending freedom. He was celebrating the total systematic destruction of my family. I picked up my encrypted phone. The timeline had violently contracted from months to mere hours. The window for passive observation and evidence gathering was completely shattered. I dialed Stephen Blackwood. He answered instantly, sensing the profound shift in my demeanor before I even spoke a word. I told Stephen that Jared was liquidating the estate off the market and finalizing his escape. I relayed the details of the offshore wire transfer and the chartered flight scheduled for Friday morning. I repeated Jared's monstrous plan to abandon Rachel in the basement to become a ward of the state. Stephen's voice was like grinding stone. He asked for my direct orders. I told him we were no longer waiting to build a slow, methodical, legal case. The intervention phase was beginning right now. I instructed Stephen to mobilize the private trauma doctors and the tactical extraction team we had on standby. We were not going to wait for Jared to make his move on Friday. We were going to blindside him. I needed the medical personnel ready to infiltrate the estate, extract the blood evidence of the poisoning directly from Rachel's veins, and administer a detox protocol to briefly clear the chemical fog from her mind. I told Stephen to prepare the emergency ex parte motions and wake up whichever federal judges he needed to wake up. We were going to freeze the offshore accounts, block the real estate transaction, and void the corrupt conservatorship before Jared even realized he was under attack. I was going to strip him of his stolen wealth, trap him inside the borders of this country, and deliver him directly into the hands of the federal marshals. Stephen confirmed the orders, his tone reflecting a lethal, calculated readiness. He promised that by tomorrow evening, we would have the undeniable medical proof required to shatter Jared's legal shield. I ended the call and looked back at the surveillance screen. Jared was still standing in the living room, admiring his reflection in the grand mirror above the fireplace. He thought he had committed the perfect, untraceable crime. I thought nobody was coming to save the broken woman scrubbing the floors. He was about to learn what happens when a father decides to burn the world down to protect his child. I needed 4 uninterrupted hours inside the estate. Without Jared or Vanessa watching Rachel, Stephen did not invent a federal officer or send them a fake government command. We already had a legitimate pressure point, Jared's rushed real estate transaction. After reviewing the recorded call with the broker, Stephen notified the financial institution handling the proposed sale that the seller's authority and the destination of the proceeds raised serious fiduciary concerns. The bank's compliance unit placed the transaction on temporary review and requested an in-person identity and authority check before any high-value international movement could proceed. The request was real. So was Jared's panic. Because Vanessa appeared in the household's medical and financial records and was tied to the arrangements Jared was presenting to the bank. The compliance team asked that she appear as well to answer questions about the authority being relied upon. At 8 that morning, the call reached the estate. I watched through the surveillance feed from my rental car 3 blocks away. Jared stormed across the living room demanding that Vanessa get dressed. He believed the $4.8 million sale would collapse if he missed the appointment. He threatened Rachel before leaving, warning her not to move from the kitchen floor. Within 20 minutes, the Porsche tore through the gates. Stephen confirmed that Jared and Vanessa had checked in at the regional banking center and that the review would keep them occupied for several hours. The bank was not part of a theatrical sting. It was protecting itself while verifying a suspicious transaction. That gave us the window we needed. I started the engine. The medical team was already on its way. I drove my vehicle up to the iron gates of the estate. Stephen arrived seconds later in a discreet black transport van. He was not alone. He had brought a private tactical medical team consisting of a highly specialized toxicologist and 2 seasoned trauma nurses who operated strictly under non-disclosure agreements. I did not need to break into the home I had purchased. During my previous visit to plant the cameras, I had quietly unlatched the secondary lock on the side patio door. We moved with absolute silent precision. Stephen led the medical personnel across the manicured lawn, and I followed closely behind, my heart pounding a heavy rhythm against my ribs. We slid through the glass doors and stepped into the sprawling, immaculate living room. The silence inside the mansion was suffocating. I guided the medical team straight toward the kitchen, my chest tightening with every step. When we turned the corner, I found my daughter exactly where Jared had commanded her to stay. She was kneeling on the cold marble floor, meticulously wiping down the baseboards with a damp rag. She was wearing that same ragged gray uniform, her movements sluggish and heavily sedated from the massive dose of tranquilizers Vanessa had forced into her breakfast oatmeal. When Rachel heard our footsteps, she dropped the rag. She scrambled backward until her frail shoulders hit the kitchen island, pulling her knees to her chest. She squeezed her eyes shut and began to apologize frantically, her voice a weak, slurred whisper. She promised Mr. Lawson that she was working hard and begged him not to be angry. It took every ounce of restraint I possessed not to completely break down. I knelt on the marble floor a few feet away from her, keeping my hands visible and my voice incredibly soft. I told her that Mr. Lawson was not here. I told her my name was Anthony, and I brought some gentle people to help her feel better. The lead toxicologist, a calm and methodical woman, stepped forward slowly. She did not wear a white that might trigger a panic response. She wore soft civilian clothes and spoke with a soothing, hypnotic rhythm. She knelt beside me and gently introduced herself to Rachel. She promised she was not going to hurt her, but she needed to check her health because she looked very tired. Rachel kept her eyes glued to the floor, her body trembling violently, but the heavy chemical suppression in her brain prevented her from fighting back or running away. She simply nodded, a heartbreaking display of total broken compliance. The nurses moved in with surgical efficiency. They opened their portable medical kits on the kitchen counter, preparing the sterile vials and syringes. The toxicologist gently took Rachel by the arm. When the doctor rolled up the sleeve of the gray uniform, I had to look away for a fraction of a second. My daughter's arms were incredibly thin, her skin pale and bruised from years of neglect and hard labor. The doctor tied the tourniquet and expertly guided the needle into a viable vein. Rachel barely flinched. She was so flooded with industrial-grade antipsychotics that the physical pain barely registered. I watched as the dark red blood filled 3 separate sterile vials. This was the undeniable forensic proof we needed. This blood would conclusively demonstrate the presence of massive, unprescribed chemical sedatives in her system. It would legally shatter the fraudulent medical evaluation Jared had purchased. But the toxicologist did not stop there. Blood evidence is crucial, but heavy tranquilizers metabolize quickly. To prove a long-term, systematic pattern of chemical abuse, we needed biological history. The doctor carefully snipped several small locks of hair cut from the nape of Rachel's neck, sealing the follicles inside sterile plastic evidence bags. Hair strands act as a chronological timeline, permanently storing the chemical signature of every drug forced into her body over the last several years. Stephen stood by the kitchen doorway, observing the entire procedure with the cold, calculating eyes of a prosecutor securing a murder weapon. I was personally documenting the chain of custody. He took high-definition photographs of the medical extraction, logging the exact time, location, and the condition of the victim. He was building an airtight federal indictment right inside Jared Lawson's kitchen. There would be absolutely no room for a defense attorney to claim the samples were contaminated or mishandled. We were securing the nails for Jared's coffin. While the medical team finished securing the biological samples, I walked over to the massive pantry. I knew exactly where to look because I had watched Vanessa on the hidden cameras. I reached all the way to the back of the highest shelf, and my fingers brushed against cold plastic. I pulled down the unmarked amber prescription bottle. It was heavy, filled with the thick white tablets they used to paralyze my daughter's mind. I handed the bottle directly to Stephen. He sealed it inside an evidence bag without a word. We now possessed the poison, the biological proof of the poisoning, and the audio-visual documentation of the perpetrators administering it. The medical work took less than 45 minutes. 3 blood vials were sealed. Hair samples were logged. The unmarked bottle of white tablets was placed into an evidence bag. Stephen photographed the condition of the kitchen, recorded the collection times, and documented every transfer of custody. For the first time since I found Rachel on the driveway, we possessed physical evidence that existed independently of Jared's paperwork. The toxicologist checked Rachel again before closing the primary sample kit. Her pulse was steady, but the sedation remained profound. She warned me that the blood draw itself would not wake Rachel, and that the safest legal strategy was still to preserve the samples, complete the toxicology review, and move through the emergency court process. I understood every word. I still could not make myself stand. Rachel sat against the kitchen cabinet, staring at her own hands as if they belonged to someone else. The nurses began packing the collection materials and securing the evidence containers for transport. I stayed on the floor beside her. The evidence was enough for the case. It was not enough for a father who had been gone 16 years. I looked at the toxicologist and realized I was about to ask for something that had nothing to do with the audit, the trust, or the court filing. I wanted my daughter back for one moment before we left. The medical team had secured the blood and hair samples. The undeniable proof of Jared Lawson and his chemical torture was safely sealed inside Stephen Blackwood and his evidence bags. But as the nurses began to pack away their equipment, I found myself unable to stand up from the cold marble floor. I was kneeling beside my daughter, watching her stare blankly at the kitchen cabinets, her body swaying slightly under the weight of the massive tranquilizers. The physical evidence was enough for a judge, but it was not enough for me as a father. I looked up at the lead toxicologist. I asked her with a voice trembling with desperate hope if there was anything she could do right now to pull Rachel out of that dark chemical fog. I needed to speak to my child. I needed to know she was still alive somewhere inside that poisoned mind. The toxicologist prepared a monitored intravenous detoxification protocol using fluids and medications, a appropriate to the sedative pattern they had documented. She was careful not to describe it as a miracle antidote. 5 years of repeated chemical suppression could not be reversed by a single bag of fluid. At best, she said, reducing the acute drug effect might give Rachel a brief interval of clearer awareness before the remaining medication in her body overwhelmed the improvement. She connected Rachel to a portable monitor first. Only after confirming her heart rhythm, blood pressure, and oxygen level did the nurse start the line. I knelt beside my daughter and held her hand. I did not ask for a cure. I asked for enough clarity for her to know she was not alone. The nurses moved with swift, silent grace. They unrolled a soft thermal blanket across the hard kitchen floor and gently guided Rachel to lie back against it. The toxicologist prepared a fresh needle and expertly inserted the intravenous line into the bruised skin of Rachel and her forearm. I moved closer, kneeling directly beside her head. I took her rough, calloused hand and wrapped it tightly between both of mine. I leaned over her, ignoring the ache in my 75-year-old knees, and kept my eyes absolutely fixed on her pale face. I prayed silently, begging whatever higher power was listening to, grant me this one single miracle. I just wanted my daughter to know that her father had finally come home to save her. For the first few agonizing minutes, nothing happened. The massive kitchen was dead silent save for the faint rhythmic dripping of the clear fluid moving through the plastic tube. I watched Rachel and her chest rise and fall in shallow, medicated breaths. Then a subtle shift began to occur. The rigid, terrified tension locked in her jaw slowly started to relax. Her breathing changed, shifting from shallow, panicked gasps into deeper, more natural inhales. I watched her hands. The mechanical trembling in her fingers gradually ceased. The chemical antagonist was fighting a brutal war inside her nervous system, pushing back the dark, heavy curtain that had smothered her consciousness for 5 agonizing years. Rachel slowly blinked her eyes. She did not flinch or cower. She simply stared up at the high ceiling, her brow furrowing in profound confusion. The empty, terrifying void that had haunted her gaze was fracturing, breaking apart piece by piece. It was exactly like watching a drowning victim slowly swim to the surface of a freezing, pitch-black ocean and finally break the water to take a breath of fresh air. She turned her head weakly against the thermal blanket and looked at me. The sheer terror of a captive facing her abuser was gone. In its place was a heartbreaking, agonizing disorientation. She stared at my face, her eyes tracing the deep lines and gray hair that the years overseas had given me. Her lips parted, trembling uncontrollably. She took a ragged breath and whispered the word, "Dad." My heart completely stopped beating. I leaned down and gathered my fragile, broken daughter into my arms. I pulled her off the floor and held her tightly against my chest, burying my face into her dull hair. I told her I was here. I told her I was so incredibly sorry it took me this long to find my way back to her. Rachel wrapped her thin, bruised arms around my neck and clung to me with a desperate, crushing strength. She began to sob. It was not the mechanical, frightened whimpering I had heard on the stone driveway the day before. It was the raw, guttural sobbing of a woman who had been buried alive in a nightmare and finally saw a crack of sunlight shining through the dirt. For 10 heartbreaking minutes, the vibrant, beautiful daughter I had raised was back with me in that kitchen. Between her agonizing sobs, the horrific truth poured out of her mouth in a rush of desperate words. She begged me to take her away from this house. She confirmed every dark suspicion Stephen and I had uncovered. She told me Jared had never taken her to a hospital. She wept as she explained that there was no car accident. She said he simply locked the heavy oak doors one afternoon 5 years ago and held her down on the floor while that horrible woman forced thick white pills down her throat. She described the endless, suffocating nightmare of the days blurring into years. She told me about the physical exhaustion of scrubbing floors until her hands bled, all while trapped inside a heavy, drugged mind that refused to let her fight back. Rachel cried against my shoulder, telling me that Jared used the drugs to erase her memories. She said he would constantly whisper terrible lies into her ear while she was sedated. He told her that her father had abandoned her, that I was disgusted by her illness, and that nobody in the outside world even remembered her name. She said, whenever she tried to resist the pills or cried out for help, Jared would drag her down the stairs and lock her in the pitch-black basement utility room for days without food. He had convinced her that she was nothing more than a worthless servant named to clean his sprawling estate. My tears soaked the collar of her ragged gray uniform as I listened to the absolute depths of his depravity. I held her tighter, rocking her gently back and forth on the floor. I swore to her on my life that Jared Lawson would never lay another finger on her. I kissed her forehead and told her she was the bravest person I had ever known. I explained as quickly and softly as I could that she had to be strong for just a little while longer. I told her I could not carry her out the front doors right now because Jared had forged legal documents to claim she belonged to him. I promised her that Stephen and I were building an ironclad federal cage for him, and if I took her away today, he might run away with her money and escape justice. I begged her to trust me, promising that I would return with an army of police before the sun went down tomorrow. As I spoke those promises, I could feel the precious clarity beginning to slip away from her. The 10-minute window was rapidly closing. The chemical antagonist in the intravenous bag was wearing off, and the massive dose of tranquilizers stored deep in her muscle tissue was flooding violently back into her brain. I felt her grip on my coat slowly loosen. Her arms went limp, dropping back down to her sides. I pulled back to look at her face. Her eyelids were drooping heavily. The terrifying vacant glaze was creeping back over her pupils like a dark shadow covering the sun. She looked at me with fading recognition, her voice slurring into a weak, breathy whisper. She begged me to hurry back before the fog swallowed her entirely. Her head lolled heavily against my chest. The brief, beautiful reunion was officially over. My daughter was a ghost, once again stolen away by the poison running through her veins. The toxicologist moved in quietly, gently removing the intravenous line and applying a fresh medical bandage over the injection site. We helped Rachel sit up, guiding her limp body back to the corner of the kitchen where Jared had ordered her to stay. She slumped against the cabinet, staring blankly at her brutalized hands, completely unaware that she had just spoken to her father. It felt like committing a mortal sin, leaving my child in that miserable condition on the cold marble floor. I wanted to tear the house down to its foundations right then and there. Stephen placed a firm, steady hand on my shoulder, reminding me of the ultimate endgame. We had everything we needed. We had the blood. We had the hair. We had the stolen pills. We walked out of the glass patio doors and moved swiftly across the manicured lawn back to the extraction van. My face was wet with tears, but my mind was operating with cold, lethal precision. I climbed into the back of the transport vehicle and looked at Stephen. The time for gathering evidence in the shadows was completely finished. I told him to freeze the offshore accounts, and prepare the federal indictments. We were going to bring the entire weight of the United States justice system crashing down on Jared Lawson, and we were going to make sure he never saw the light of day again. The transport van pulled away from the estate, with the evidence secured between us. Stephen even opened his laptop before we reached the main road. Rachel's captivity had been built through two systems at once: a state conservatorship that gave Jared legal control over her, and an interstate financial scheme that moved her money through multiple jurisdictions. Stephen attacked both structures separately instead of pretending one judge could erase everything with a single signature. His probate team filed an emergency petition in the court that had granted Jared authority 5 years earlier. The filing included the preliminary toxicology findings, the financial audit, the irregular medical evidence. Rachel's brief statement during the detox window, and the recordings showing coercion confinement and forced signatures. At the same time, Stephen's federal team delivered the traced financial evidence, the offshore transfer records, and Jared's recorded escape plan to the appropriate investigators. They sought emergency preservation orders over the identified accounts and the pending estate sale proceeds. Both proceedings were initially sealed because warning Jared could have triggered flight evidence destruction or another attempt to move Rachel. By evening, an on-call probate judge had reviewed the emergency record and suspended Jared's conservatorship authority pending a full hearing. The court appointed temporary independent protection for Rachel and barred Jared from relocating her or making additional medical or financial decisions in her name. The next morning, after an emergency review of the fraudulent medical foundation and the new toxicology evidence, the probate court vacated the conservatorship. Separately, federal authorities obtained orders freezing the domestic and offshore accounts that could be traced to the trust diversions. The $4.8 million property transaction was blocked before the proceeds could be released. Travel alerts were also entered through the active investigation. Jared and Vanessa could not quietly board the chartered flight, while warrants and charging decisions were being completed. Stephen never told me that every account Jared had ever touched had magically become government property. The orders were narrower and stronger than that. They immobilized the money tied to the suspected fraud and prevented the planned escape while investigators worked. That was enough. The legal authority over Rachel was gone. The important money was frozen. The exit route was closed. For the next 24 hours, Jared knew none of it. I watched him return to the estate, furious about the bank review and still behaving like the undisputed master of the house. He kicked at Rachel's shoe, threatened the basement, and assured Vanessa that the money would clear the next morning. I was performing sovereignty inside a kingdom that had already been taken away from him on paper. I wanted to enter the house and remove Rachel immediately. Stephen reminded me that we now had lawful authority to protect her and investigators positioned to act. The safest way to finish the case was to control the final confrontation instead of creating chaos around a medically fragile victim. So I chose the bait. I would invite Jared and Vanessa to dinner and offer them the one thing powerful enough to make them walk willingly into the center of the trap. $40 million. The toxicology laboratory sent an expedited preliminary report while the emergency papers were being prepared. The concentrations in Rachel's blood were inconsistent with the treatment history Jared had represented to the probate court, and the hair analysis showed repeated exposure over time. The report did not claim that one test could reconstruct every dose from 5 years, but it corroborated the pattern captured on video and described by Rachel during her brief period of clarity. Stephen used that distinction carefully. The probate filing did not ask the judge to decide the entire criminal case overnight. It asked the court to remove the immediate danger created by Jared's authority over Rachel. The federal application did not ask for ownership of every asset Jared possessed. It identified specific accounts, entities, and pending proceeds tied to the suspected trust diversion and escape plan. That narrowness made the orders stronger. They were designed to preserve people, money, and evidence until the full adversarial process could begin. I watched my laptop screen as the charcoal sports car pulled back into the sprawling driveway late that afternoon. Jared and Vanessa walked through the glass patio doors looking furious and exhausted from their pointless trip to the regional bank. Jared threw his keys onto the marble kitchen island, completely oblivious to the fact that just a few hours ago, a medical team had saved his wife on that exact same floor. He paced the kitchen, complaining loudly to Vanessa about the bureaucratic incompetence of the banking system. He arrogantly assured her that the wire transfer would clear by tomorrow morning, and they would be sipping champagne on a private jet to a tropical paradise by Friday afternoon. He walked over to the corner where Rachel was still sitting, slumped against the cabinets, recovering from the brutal shift in her chemical balance. Jared sneered at her, kicking her ragged shoes with the tip of his expensive leather loafer. He told her she was a worthless burden and mocked her, warning her that she was going to spend a very long time in the dark basement before the week was over. He laughed and walked away to pour himself a drink, acting like the undisputed master of his domain. I thought about my beautiful daughter sitting on that cold kitchen floor, entirely unaware that her salvation had already been secured on paper. I wanted to storm the house and drag her out right then, but Stephen insisted we follow the protocol to ensure Jared and Vanessa could not claim they were victims of a home invasion. We needed them to willingly walk out of the estate and straight into the hands of the authorities. I began drafting a message in my mind, knowing I needed the perfect bait to draw them away from Rachel and out into the open. I would use the one thing they loved more than anything else in the world to lure them to their doom. I would use the promise of my entire $40 million fortune. The legal and financial exits were securely locked, and now it was time to issue the invitation for the final confrontation. I picked up my phone and stared at the blank screen for a long moment. I closed my eyes and drew upon every ounce of acting ability I had perfected over 40 years of cutthroat corporate negotiations. I needed to become the exact victim Jared believed me to be. I needed to sound like a broken, defeated old man who had completely surrendered to the tragedy of his child and her broken mind. I dialed his number and waited. He answered on the second ring. His voice sounded tight and agitated, probably because he had spent the entire morning screaming at bank tellers trying to figure out why his offshore transfers were failing. I softened my voice, making it tremble just enough to sound authentic. I told him I had spent the last 2 days sitting alone in my hotel room, thinking about everything he had told me. I praised his dedication. I thanked him for carrying the heavy burden of the medical condition of Rachel, all by himself for the past 5 years. I could hear the immediate shift in his breathing. The tension in his voice vanished entirely, replaced by that smooth, sickeningly sweet tone of a predator who thinks his prey has finally stopped struggling. He told me it was his duty as a husband, and that he loved her more than life itself. It took every shred of my willpower not to crush the phone in my hand. Instead, I swallowed the bile rising in my throat and dangled the ultimate bait. I told Jared that watching Rachel scrub those stones had broken my heart, but it also opened my eyes. I said I realized my time on this earth was coming to an end. I explained that I had spent the last 48 hours liquidating the entirety of my international logistics portfolio. I told him I had $40 million sitting in cash, and I did not want to leave it to the chaotic probate courts when my heart finally gave out. I let the silence hang in the air for a fraction of a second. Then I delivered the final blow. I told him I wanted to transfer the entire $40 million fortune directly into his conservatorship. I said I wanted him to have absolute total control over the money so he could guarantee Rachel received world-class care for the rest of her natural life. The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. I could practically hear his greedy heart hammering against his ribs. $40 million. It was a sum of money that dwarfed whatever he had managed to steal from the trust fund. It was the ultimate payout. Jared managed to steady his voice, telling me that I was being incredibly generous and that he would be honored to manage the estate to honor my legacy. I told him we should not wait another day. I invited him and Vanessa to join me for a celebratory dinner at the estate that very evening. I said I was bringing my lawyer to draft the preliminary letters of intent, and I wanted us to break bread as a united family one last time. He accepted the invitation with breathless enthusiasm, promising they would be waiting for me at 7 in the evening sharp. By 6 in the evening, the estate looked calm. Rachel was under medical supervision in a protected room far from the dining area. Stephen had coordinated with the investigators holding the active warrants, but the marshals were not hiding inside my daughter's bedrooms waiting for dinner guests. They staged nearby out of sight, ready to enter only after Stephen gave the agreed signal. I took my place at the head of the mahogany table. The house belonged to Rachel again on paper. Jared and Vanessa simply did not know it yet. I walked into the grand dining room and took my seat at the head of the massive mahogany table. I wore my finest tailored suit, the same dark navy wool I wore when I dismantled rival corporations. I did not look like a grieving grandfather anymore. The dining room was illuminated by a spectacular crystal chandelier, casting a warm, inviting glow over the empty plates and polished silverware. I sat there, in absolute stillness, listening to the grandfather clock tick away, the final minutes of freedom for Jared Lawson. Every tick echoed through the cavernous room, reminding me of the countless hours my daughter had spent scrubbing these floors on her hands and knees. I thought about the sheer volume of poison they had forced down her throat, and the immense psychological damage they had inflicted upon her soul just to satisfy their pathetic desires for sports cars and designer clothing. The anger inside me was no longer a burning, chaotic flame. It had crystallized into something completely cold and dense and unbreakable. I was a father preparing to execute the absolute annihilation of the monsters who had preyed upon his only child. I took a slow, deep breath, steadying my heart rate and clearing my mind of everything except the tactical destruction of the enemies walking to my door. Precisely at 7 in the evening, I heard the heavy roar of the stolen Porsche pulling up the driveway. The heavy oak front doors swung open, and the sound of confident, arrogant laughter echoed into the foyer. Jared and Vanessa walked into the dining room looking like absolute royalty. They strutted through the archway with the careless swagger of people who believed they had successfully outsmarted the entire world. Jared was wearing a crisp designer suit, his hair perfectly slicked back, and his expensive gold watch catching the light of the chandelier. Vanessa walked closely beside him, draped in an expensive emerald silk dress. She carried a rare imported leather handbag and wore a fresh set of diamond necklaces that I am certain she purchased with the stolen money of my daughter. They carried themselves with an intoxicating aura of invincibility. They were completely blind to the shadows shifting in the corners of the estate and entirely unaware of the armed federal agents waiting in silence just behind the dining room walls. They looked radiant. They looked like a couple who had just won the largest lottery in human history. Jared walked toward me with his arms wide open, his face stretched into a massive, victorious smile. He greeted me enthusiastically, telling me how wonderful it was to see me looking so well rested. Vanessa offered a polite, practiced nod, her eyes darting around the room, looking for the lawyer and the documents that would secure her luxurious future. I remained seated at the head of the table. I did not stand to greet them. I did not offer my hand to shake. I simply stared at them, letting the heavy, oppressive silence stretch out until the triumphant smiles began to falter on their faces. Jared lowered his arms, looking slightly confused by my cold demeanor. He pulled out a chair for Vanessa and then took a seat directly to my right, trying to maintain his smooth, confident composure. He asked me if my lawyer was running late and suggested we open a bottle of champagne to celebrate this momentous occasion. I sat at the head of the massive mahogany table watching Jared and his mistress settle into their chairs. Jared poured 3 glasses of vintage champagne and slid one across the polished wood toward me. He raised his own glass high in the air, offering a toast to family, to legacy, and to the lifelong care of my beloved Rachel. He wore a smile so perfectly crafted it could have fooled a saint, but I saw the raw, insatiable greed burning behind his eyes. Vanessa mirrored his enthusiasm, raising her glass and adjusting the diamond earrings she had stolen from my daughter. They sat there waiting for me to drink, waiting for me to pull out a pen and sign over the remaining $40 million of my life work. I did not touch the crystal glass. I did not return their smiles. I simply leaned back in my chair and let the silence stretch across the dining room. The seconds ticked by heavily. The victorious energy radiating from Jared began to fracture. He slowly lowered his glass, his brow furrowing in confusion. He asked me if I was feeling unwell and offered to call for a doctor. I told him my heart was functioning perfectly for the first time in years. My voice no longer trembled. I stripped away the fragile, heartbroken persona I had worn since the moment I stepped onto his driveway. I spoke with the deep, resonant authority of a man who had spent 4 decades dismantling global monopolies. I told Jared that before we transferred any funds, we needed to conduct a preliminary audit of his recent management strategies. Jared forced a chuckle, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. He told me an audit was entirely unnecessary and reminded me that the court had already vetted his conservatorship. He insisted his record was spotless. I preferred to verify things myself. I reached into the inside pocket of my tailored suit jacket and pulled out a small black remote control. I placed it flat on the mahogany table and pressed a single button. The state-of-the-art sound system wired through the ceiling of the dining room roared to life. I did not play a piece of classical music to accompany our dinner. I played the crystal-clear audio file I had extracted from the hidden camera in the master bedroom. Jared and his mistress froze completely as their own voices echoed off the dining room walls. The audio filled the space with absolute, devastating clarity. We sat in silence and listened to Jared bragging about moving $3 million to the Cayman Islands. We listened to Vanessa complaining in her shrill, arrogant tone about my daughter ruining the aesthetic of the luxury house. We listened as the recorded version of Jared promised to drain the trust fund completely in 6 months. Sell the estate for cash and abandon Rachel in a state-run psychiatric ward where she would be chemically restrained and forgotten. Vanessa dropped her champagne glass. It shattered against the hardwood floor, spilling expensive wine across the imported rug. All the color violently drained from her face, leaving her looking like a terrified ghost. She stared at the ceiling speakers and then turned her horrified gaze toward Jared. Jared forced a loud, nervous laugh and slapped his hand on the table. He looked at me with wide, innocent eyes and told me the recording was a complete fabrication. He claimed it was a malicious deepfake created by artificial intelligence. He spun a rapid, frantic story, insisting that rival logistics companies were trying to sabotage my estate and destroy our family. He told me I was being manipulated by corporate spies who wanted to steal the $40 million. He pleaded with me to use logic, reminding me how much he loved my daughter and how he had sacrificed 5 years of his life to nurse her through her severe brain trauma. Vanessa quickly joined the chorus of lies. Her voice trembled as she placed a hand over her chest, feigning absolute outrage. She swore she would never say such horrible things about a sick woman. She insisted she was a dedicated medical professional who only wanted to bring peace to my troubled child. They sat there, spinning a web of increasingly desperate excuses, trying to gaslight me into doubting my own ears. I let them talk. I sat perfectly still and allowed them to exhaust their arsenal of lies. When Jared finally stopped speaking, his chest heaving as he waited for my reaction, I leaned forward and folded my hands together on the table. I told Jared his performance was truly remarkable, but his audience had completely lost interest. I informed him that the audio was not a deepfake. I told him it was a direct recording from the micro camera I had personally planted behind the decorative lamp in his master bedroom while he was out spending my stolen money. I did not stop there. I told him I also knew about the corrupt, gambling-addicted doctor he had bribed to sign the fraudulent medical affidavit. I told him I knew there was never a car crash on a rainy highway. I told him I watched his mistress rush unprescribed industrial tranquilizers into my daughter and her morning oatmeal. And I watched him lock my terrified child in a pitch-black basement utility room. Jared pushed his chair back, the legs scraping loudly against the floor. He tried to stand up, his eyes darting frantically toward the large windows and the main hallway. He stammered out a threat, telling me I had no legal right to record him in his own home. He declared that he was still the legal conservator, and he ordered me to get out of his house immediately before he called the police and had me arrested for trespassing. He tried to project authority, but his voice cracked with pure, unadulterated panic. I looked up at him with a cold, hollow smile. I told him he was more than welcome to call the police, but I had already taken the liberty of inviting the authorities to our little celebration. Before Jared could take a single step toward the exit, the heavy double doors of the dining room swung open. The sound was like thunder. Stephen Blackwood stepped into the room wearing a sharp charcoal suit and carrying a thick leather briefcase. But Stephen did not walk in alone. He was flanked by 6 heavily armed United States Marshals wearing tactical vests and serious, unyielding expressions. The Marshals immediately fanned out across the dining room, blocking every possible exit. Their presence instantly sucked all the remaining oxygen out of the space. Vanessa let out a shrill, terrified scream and stumbled backward, knocking her chair over as she tried to retreat into the corner. She pressed her back against the expensive wallpaper, shaking violently, as two armed agents moved swiftly toward her. Jared stood frozen at the table, his eyes wide with absolute horror. He looked at the federal agents and then looked back at me, his mouth opening and closing silently. The reality of his complete destruction had finally arrived, and it wore a badge. Stephen placed his briefcase on the table beside my untouched champagne. His voice remained level as he told Jared that the emergency probate orders had vacated his conservatorship and transferred Rachel's protection to independent authority. Jared no longer had legal control over her medical care, her residence, or her trust. Separate federal orders had already preserved the financial evidence and accounts tied to the suspected fraud. Jared shook his head in frantic denial, insisting the marshals had no jurisdiction and demanding to speak to his lawyer. He yelled that he had a $4.8 million real estate transaction pending, and they were ruining his life. Stephen opened his briefcase and laid the warrant packet beside Jared's untouched champagne. The pending $4.8 million estate transfer had been stopped before disbursement. The domestic accounts and offshore entities traced to Rachel's trust were frozen under court orders while investigators followed the money. He then explained that active travel alerts and warrants had been entered before Jared's planned charter departure. If Jared or Vanessa tried to use the flight as an escape route, the authorities waiting on that route would stop them. There was no tropical exit, no usable offshore payout, and no conservatorship left to hide behind. Jared's knees nearly gave out as Stephen opened the next section of the warrant packet. The $4.8 million estate sale had been stopped before closing. The traced accounts, holding proceeds from Rachel's trust, were frozen pending forfeiture and restitution proceedings. The domestic shell entities were under preservation orders, and the offshore transfers Jared believed would finance his escape were no longer available to him. His access had effectively dropped to zero. That did not mean the government had magically erased every dollar he had ever earned. It meant that the money tied to the suspected fraud could not be moved while investigators and the courts determined ownership. Jared looked at me as though I could reverse it with a phone call. He began begging. He said he had made mistakes. He said Vanessa had pressured him. He said the offshore accounts were only temporary investment vehicles and that every decision had been made for Rachel's care. I listened without interrupting. Then he reached for the last shield he thought remained. He pointed toward the ceiling and shouted that Rachel was legally incompetent. He insisted the conservatorship still proved he had acted as her lawful guardian. He demanded that the marshals check the probate record and accused Stephen of manufacturing an illegal family coup. Stephen waited until he finished. Then he placed the emergency probate orders on the table. The conservatorship had been vacated. Independent protective authority had replaced Jared's control over Rachel. The financial orders were separate. So were the arrest warrants. Jared stared at the signatures on the pages and finally understood that this was not a private argument. He could win by raising his voice. The legal structure he had used to isolate Rachel was gone, and the financial structure he had built around her trust was being examined transaction by transaction. He looked toward the dining room doors. The marshals did not rush him. They did not need to. Every exit was controlled, and the lead marshal calmly told him to remain where he was while Stephen finished identifying the evidence supporting the warrants. Vanessa had backed against the wall. Her face had changed. Until that moment, she had watched Jared lie with the confidence of someone expecting him to talk them both out of trouble. Now she was studying him like a person trapped on a sinking boat, deciding whether the man beside her was still useful. Jared sensed it. He turned on her before she could speak. He said the pills were Vanessa's idea. He claimed she handled Rachel's food and medication, and that he had trusted her because she presented herself as a trained caregiver. Vanessa's mouth fell open. The alliance that had survived 5 years of abuse lasted less than 5 minutes under legal pressure. Stephen closed the financial folder. "There is one more witness you relied on," he said. Jared froze. "The physician." the man whose signature had made the entire conservatorship possible. Jared tried to speak, but no sound came out. That was when I told him the medical story had collapsed too. For the first time that evening, Jared stopped performing. He did not look angry or offended. He looked afraid of the evidence that existed beyond his control. I let out a low, cold laugh that echoed sharply off the crystal chandelier above us. I walked slowly around the dining table, stopping just inches from his terrified, sweating face. I told Jared that his licensed physician was currently singing like a frightened bird in a federal interrogation room. I watched the last single drop of hope violently drain from his face as Stephen explained the rest of the trap. Federal agents had raided the private clinic of his disgraced, gambling-addicted doctor earlier that afternoon. The moment the agents confronted the doctor with the offshore wire transfers and the evidence of his massive sports betting syndicate debts, the coward broke completely. He flipped on Jared in a matter of minutes. The doctor confessed on a recorded line that he had never even met Rachel. He admitted to the federal authorities that he signed the fraudulent incompetence papers entirely to save his own miserable life from the gambling syndicate. The fabricated car accident, the phantom brain trauma, the false medical affidavits, all of it was exposed and officially documented as an elaborate criminal fraud. Vanessa was pressed against the expensive floral wallpaper across the room, trembling so violently her knees finally gave out. She slumped heavily to the floor, her designer emerald silk dress pooling around her ankles. When she heard that the doctor had confessed, she instantly realized the entire criminal enterprise had spectacularly collapsed. She knew she was going to spend the rest of her natural life locked inside a concrete cell. Like all true parasites, she instantly turned on her host to save her own skin. Vanessa began to weep hysterically, pointing a perfectly manicured finger directly at Jared. She screamed that it was all his idea. She cried out to the marshals, claiming she was just an innocent victim caught in his manipulative web. She sobbed, throwing her hands in the air, swearing that Jared had forced her to stay in the house. She lied beautifully, claiming she was terrified of his violent temper, and that she only played the role of the nurse because he threatened to kill her if she ever tried to leave the estate. She begged the officers to believe she had absolutely no idea about the stolen millions or the fake medical records. She performed the role of a traumatized hostage with sickening, enthusiastic desperation. I looked down at her with pure, unadulterated disgust. I reached into the inside pocket of my tailored suit jacket and pulled out my mobile device, syncing it seamlessly with the large flat-screen television mounted directly above the dining room fireplace. I told Vanessa she was a truly terrible actress. I pressed a single button on my screen. The massive television flickered to life, broadcasting the high-definition, hidden camera footage from the kitchen earlier that very morning. The entire dining room fell dead silent as the surveillance video played. We watched the massive screen as Vanessa strolled into the kitchen, wearing her sheer silk robe, casually sipping an espresso. We watched her bark cruel, demeaning orders at my fragile, terrified daughter, who was cowering against the marble counter. Then came the undeniable, damning forensic evidence. The camera clearly captured Vanessa reaching into the high pantry cabinet, pulling out the unmarked amber prescription bottle and dumping the massive industrial tranquilizers into the heavy stone mortar. The sickening sound of her grinding the pills into a fine powder echoed loudly through the dining room speakers. We watched her deliberately mix the poison into the breakfast oatmeal and aggressively force my daughter to swallow it, bite by agonizing bite. The video showed Vanessa leaning against the counter, smirking with arrogant amusement as the heavy sedatives completely paralyzed my child and her nervous system. Vanessa stopped crying instantly. Her mouth hung open in absolute breathless horror. She stared at the television screen, watching herself commit severe pharmaceutical torture in crystal-clear high definition. The federal marshals stared at their screen, their expressions hardening into pure, furious disgust. The lead marshal did not hesitate for another second. He yanked Vanessa up from the floor, roughly twisting her arms behind her back. The sharp metallic snap of handcuffs locking tightly around her wrists echoed through the room like a gunshot. She did not scream or fight back. The video had completely shattered her fabricated defense. She was totally paralyzed by the reality of her own documented cruelty. Stephen stepped forward after the video ended. He did not predict sentences or promise where anyone would spend the rest of life. He stated only what the warrants and referrals already supported: federal wire fraud and conspiracy allegations, plus serious evidence of unlawful confinement, coercion, drugging, and falsified medical records that would be addressed by the appropriate prosecutors. Vanessa had stopped crying. Jared had stopped arguing. For the first time that night, neither of them had a story left. The lead marshal stepped forward when the video ended. Jared was taken first. He did not fight. His wrists were secured behind him while he stared at the floor, stripped of every argument he had used for 5 years. Another marshal turned Vanessa around and cuffed her beside the wall. Stephen made one point clear. The federal warrants covered the financial conspiracy and related offenses supported by the investigation. The kidnapping, assault, confinement, and drugging evidence would also be referred to the appropriate prosecutors. No one in that dining room was promising a sentence. I walked close enough for Jared to hear me. "You told Rachel nobody was coming to save her." He looked up. "You were wrong." The marshals led both of them out of the estate. The criminal cases did not end in a week. They took months of motions, forensic review, medical testimony, tracing, and challenges to the recordings and trust records. The physician who had signed the false incompetence report cooperated with investigators and admitted that he had never performed the examination described in the conservatorship file. The evidence survived those challenges. Jared and Vanessa were ultimately convicted on the principal federal fraud counts and on the serious offenses arising from Rachel's confinement and chemical abuse. The courts imposed multi-decade prison sentences. I did not need a dramatic promise that either of them would die behind bars. The punishment belonged to the judges who heard the evidence. I sat beside Rachel when the final sentences were imposed. I did not smile. A prison term could punish the people who hurt her. It could not return the 5 years they stole. The more important work began after the legal case stabilized. The clandestine sale of the $6.5 million estate was canceled. Control of Rachel's property and trust was restored through the court-supervised process, and the funds traced from Jared's offshore structures were directed into restitution and recovery proceedings. Rachel had no desire to return to the house where she had been imprisoned. I did not ask her to. As soon as her doctors cleared the trip, I took her to a premier neurological rehabilitation clinic in Switzerland. On the flight, she slept with her hand wrapped around mine. For the first time in 5 years, nobody was ordering her to scrub a floor, swallow a pill, sign a document, or ask permission to exist. The house itself remained under Rachel's legal control while the recovery process was completed. Whether she ever sold it would be her decision after she was healthy enough to make it freely. For now, the only decision that mattered was getting her somewhere safe enough to heal. I flew her directly to a premier neurological rehabilitation clinic nestled deep in the pristine mountains of Switzerland. It was a world-class medical sanctuary surrounded by crystal-clear lakes and towering snow-capped peaks. I wanted her to wake up every morning and see absolutely nothing but beauty, open spaces, and freedom. She had stared at the dark walls of a basement utility room for 5 years. Now she was going to breathe the cleanest air on the planet. The first few months at the clinic were the most grueling test of endurance either of us had ever faced. The physical detoxification from 5 years of heavy industrial tranquilizers was an agonizing process. There were days when Rachel trembled violently, her body fighting desperately to expel the poison that had suppressed her nervous system for so long. There were terrible nights when she woke up screaming, trapped in the lingering nightmares of Jared yelling at her in the dark. I never left her side. I slept in a chair next to her hospital bed, holding her hand and reminding her every single hour that the monsters were gone forever. The medical team at the clinic was extraordinary. They employed advanced cognitive behavioral therapy, rigorous physical rehabilitation, and profound psychological support. I watched a team of dedicated professionals slowly rebuild my daughter piece by piece. Slowly, miraculously, the daughter I had raised began to return to me. It started with small physical changes. The dark, terrifying circles under her eyes began to fade. Her hollow cheeks filled out with healthy color, and her brutally calloused hands healed, softening with proper care and nutrition. But the most beautiful transformation was the lifting of the mental fog. The heavy curtain of chemical suppression finally tore apart. One afternoon, while we were walking through the quiet alpine gardens of the clinic, she stopped and pointed at a patch of bright blue flowers. She looked at me and smiled. It was a genuine, radiant smile that reached all the way to her eyes. She told me they reminded her of the hydrangeas we used to plant together when she was a little girl. My heart soared completely out of my chest. Her memory was not permanently destroyed. It had just been buried alive, and now it was finally breaking free. Fast forward 1 year. Today, the frail, terrified woman scrubbing stone pavers on her hands and knees is nothing but a distant memory. Rachel is fully recovered. She is vibrant, brilliant, and fiercely independent. The sheer resilience of her spirit completely humbles me. She did not just survive her trauma. She conquered it with a strength that defies all logic. We returned to the United States, but we did not go back to the East Coast. We bought a beautiful, sunlit property in the quiet hills of Northern California. Rachel now manages her trust with Stephen's help and independent professional oversight. Every distribution is transparent to her. Every major decision requires her informed approval. She asks questions, reads the documents, and refuses to surrender control simply because someone speaks with confidence. More important, money is no longer the center of her life. She fills her days with ordinary choices that were denied to her for 5 years: where to live, what to eat, when to travel, whom to trust, and when to say no. Watching her make those decisions freely is worth more to me than any balance sheet I ever built. Sometimes I sit on this porch and think about the sheer audacity of what Jared tried to accomplish. He used the legal system as a weapon, forging documents and bribing disgraced doctors to strip away the human rights of a completely healthy woman. He thought wealth provided a perfect shield against consequence. He forgot that wealth is just a tool, and in the hands of a man who actually knows how to use it, it becomes an instrument of absolute justice. I made sure his name was erased from every financial ledger and every property deed. He has no legacy left. His entire existence has been reduced to an inmate number stamped on an orange jumpsuit. Rachel and I never speak his name anymore. We do not give him the power of our attention. We fill our days with new memories. We travel together, taking quiet weekend trips to the coast and exploring the world at our own pace. Seeing her walk along the beach, feeling the ocean breeze in her hair, without a single trace of fear in her posture, is the greatest reward I could ever ask for. The darkness we fought through only made the light of these days that much brighter. As for me, I am 76 years old now, but I feel decades younger. The crushing fatigue and profound loneliness that haunted my years overseas have completely vanished. I spend my mornings drinking coffee on the patio, watching Rachel laugh and thrive in the warm California sun. I do not travel anymore. I do not manage global supply chains or fight hostile corporate wars. I have handed over the reins of my company to a trusted board of directors. My empire is right here, sitting across the breakfast table from me. I look back on that crisp Tuesday morning when I walked up that stone driveway, and I realize how incredibly close I came to losing everything that truly mattered. Jared Lawson thought he could prey upon a woman because he believed nobody was watching. He thought he could steal a massive fortune because he assumed an old man would be too weak and too gullible to fight back. He relied on the illusion of a perfect family to mask a profound and sickening evil, but he learned the hardest lesson a predator can ever learn. You can never underestimate the lengths a father will go to protect his child. I found my ultimate peace. The money is completely secure, the criminals are rotting away in federal prison, and my daughter is finally truly free. I got my little girl back, and that is a victory worth more than all the money in the entire world. Thank you for listening to my story. If you ever find yourself doubting your instincts, when something feels wrong with the people you love, do not stay silent. Do not accept the plausible lies. Ask the hard questions. Dig deeper into the shadows. You might just save a life. Reflecting on this harrowing experience, I learned that true evil rarely wears a monstrous face. It often hides behind the charming smiles of the people we invite into our homes and trust with our most precious loved ones. When confronted with a situation that defies logic, a plausible excuse can be deeply comforting, but your gut instinct is a survival mechanism honed over a lifetime. I realized that wealth and resources are meaningless if you are not vigilant about who is managing them. Protecting your family requires more than just financial provision. It requires active, unyielding observation. Never allow the comfort of a smooth explanation to override the undeniable physical and psychological evidence standing right in front of your eyes. The moment you ignore a red flag, you give a predator permission to thrive.